In this session, we're going to focus on some metrics that can be used to assess how an organization is doing in terms of their overall inventory management. Before we get into the metrics, let's take a look at what does inventory management mean. The idea of inventory management is that an organization is able to serve its customers in a timely manner. So when there are orders, there's material available, and at the same time do it in an efficient way such that the costs for the company are as low as possible. So it's being effective in terms of serving the customer. At the same time, it's being efficient in terms of its costs of holding inventory and its costs of managing that inventory. So let's take a look at the first metric that gets at the idea of how a company is performing in terms of its inventory management. This is called the inventory turnover, and the idea is we're looking at how many times the inventory was turned over by the sales. So it's the ratio of annual sales to the average inventory that is held. So the average inventory can be the average of the opening and closing inventory, or if there's inventory taken at multiple times during that period, it's the average of those periods. Typically, you take it as the average of the opening and closing inventory because that's what's available to us from the balance sheet of a company. So let's take a look at an example of where we can use this metric to look at to assess a particular company's inventory performance. So here we have a company called Trinitron Garments, and their sales last year, their cost of goods sold for their sales last year was 19 million. So we're taking their sales at their cost of goods sold, not including their profit margin. The company's opening and closing inventories are given to us as 3.25 million and 1.85 million, and we have to calculate the inventory turnover. So why don't you take these numbers and digest them for a minute, think about them for a minute, and then we'll come back and do the calculation of the inventory turnover ratio for this. All right, so let's work through the numbers here. So the average inventory here is going to be based on the opening and closing. So we have the average inventory that we can compute. And the opening inventory here is 3.25 million. The closing inventory is 1.85. We take the average of those two and we get an average inventory of 2.55 million. Next, we need their cost of goods sold, and we have that given to us as 19 million. So cost of goods sold is 19 million. So the inventory turnover ratio is going to be based on the cost of goods sold of 19 million, and you divide that by 2.5 million, 2.55 million, and that gives us an inventory turnover ratio of 7.45. Now, what does this mean? It means that they're turning over their inventory 7.45 times. Whether it's a good number or a bad number would depend on you comparing the inventory turnover ratio of this year versus last year, or you could compare it with competitors, other people in the same industry, and their inventory turnover ratio. So without having that kind of a comparison, you really can't say whether it's a good or a bad inventory turnover ratio because it will differ considerably from industry to industry. Right. Now let's take a look at another similar ratio, and here's the solution for you in terms of what we found there. It was 7.45 as the turnover ratio. But let's take a look at another ratio called days of supply. Now effectively, this is the reciprocal of what we saw earlier as the inventory turnover ratio. So what we're doing here is we're saying that it's how many days of supply are being held in inventory, and it's based on average inventory divided by daily sales. Now we have daily sales here. Could be weekly sales if you were looking at weeks of supply. It could be monthly sales if you were looking at months of supply. So based on what makes sense in your business, you would be using that type of a unit for doing this analysis. So in terms of taking the same example that we had earlier, the cost of goods sold was 19 million. Companies' opening and closing inventories were 3.25 and 1.85. Now you can go ahead and calculate the days of supply for this company. All right. Now for calculating the days of supply, we already calculated the average inventory earlier, so we can simply use that, and we have the average inventory, and you might recall that was calculated as 2.55 million. That was the average inventory we had. We want to take the total sales and convert it to daily sales. So we're going to take the 19 million of sales that we have for this company given to us, and we're going to take 19 million, divide that by 365 days, and that gives us 52,055. Right. So the days of supply are going to be the average inventory of 2.55 million, and we're going to divide that by the daily sales, which is 52,055. And what this gives us is how many days of supply do they have at any point in time stored in their warehouses. So that's the perspective we're using here. Kind of the opposite of what we had earlier in terms of inventory turnover. Now we're saying that they have at any point in time 50 days worth of inventory, 50 days worth of sales stored in their warehouses. So here are the numbers to you in clear typed form. And then let's look at another metric that's commonly used in accounting circles and in finance circles, where we talk about the cash-to-cash cycle. And the idea here is how much time does the cash stay in circulation in terms of your sales versus your purchases and your inventories. So you're taking those three different things, and you're looking at how much time is being spent by that dollar in this entire process of you buying stuff and you selling stuff and keeping it in inventory. So in order to go through the mechanics of similar kind of calculations for the cash-to-cash ratio as we did for the other two ratios, let's take a look at data from the same company, Trinitron Garments, except here we have some additional information. So here we have the sales at selling price and the sales at cost, because we need both of them in order to look at the three components of the cash-to-cash ratio. And we have information, in addition to having information about inventory, now we also have information about the accounts receivable, the opening and closing, and the accounts payable, the opening and closing for that. So take this information and calculate the cash-to-cash cycle, the cash-to-cash cycle for Trinitron Garments, and see what you find. All right, so let's see what you would have found when you calculated the three components of the cash-to-cash ratio, cash-to-cash cycle here. The first part of it is the days of supply. This is something that we'd calculated earlier at 48.99. The accounts receivable is going to be a new calculation for us. And here you're taking the average receivables, so the opening and the closing receivables, and you're dividing them, and this is where it's a little bit different, you're dividing them by the daily sales at the selling price, because this is talking about receivables. You've sold the goods to your customers, and you're talking about it in terms of selling price. So that works out to 24.48. The days of accounts payable works out to the average payables divided by daily sales at cost, 55.23. So the total cash-to-cash cycle is 18.24 days. So this is telling you that based on how quickly your money is being turned around, based on how much time it's taking your money to turn around, it's taking 18.24 days for your purchases to get converted into sales. Now, whether 18.24 is a good number or not, the answer will be it depends on a comparison with previous years. It depends on a comparison with industry, and just to give you a perspective on this, Dell Computers which was very well known in the past for paying its suppliers with a longer period of time for days payable and getting its customers to pay well in advance of them receiving their goods, worked with a negative cash-to-cash cycle. The additional component was that they had very little inventory that they held in terms of work in process. So you can get some perspective of what a good cash-to-cash cycle would be. So what we've looked at here is three ways of measuring the inventory performance of a company. The first one being an inventory turnover ratio. How often are you able to turn your inventory? Then we looked at the days of inventory that's being held in your warehouses. And finally, we looked at the cash-to-cash cycle, which is also known as cash conversion cycle.